Next we have our first keynote, Dr. Tracey Bretag for the University of South Australia. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. I'm so excited to be here to share something which is of utmost importance to me in terms of my research and my practice over the last 10 years. It really is a joy to be here, so thanks for having me. You'll notice that my presentation title is slightly different from the abstract you have. I assure you I will be looking at policy practice and what's next for academic integrity. But what I've decided to do, a little bit like Will, talking about 10 years in 10 minutes, I thought I would try to wrap up some of my ideas and call them the Big Five of academic integrity, in keeping with the 5th International Plagiarism Conference. Now, it was a harder task than I thought it would be, actually, to get everything into groups of 5, but I've tried to do that for you. You'll also notice throughout the presentation a repeating image of an iceberg, and I'll invite you to think what that might mean, what it might mean for academic integrity and how we foster a culture of integrity. I will, throughout the presentation, elaborate on that a little bit more. I think it would be remiss of me to start with any explication of academic integrity without referring to the Centre for Academic Integrity, the International Centre for Academic Integrity. Teddy Fishman is here, the director of that centre. When I first started researching academic integrity about 10 years ago, I saw this definition on what was then the CAI site, and I flippantly thought, yeah, that's a great definition of academic integrity, but I didn't really understand how really well explicated it is. And I'll take you through it. It is the 5 fundamental values of academic integrity. How perfect that it's 5. And it's from the Fundamental Values Project of 1999. Academic integrity is a commitment, even in the face of adversity, to 5 fundamental values: honesty, trust, fairness, respect, and responsibility. Honesty, trust, fairness, respect, and responsibility. We'll be referring to those values throughout the rest of my presentation. What I love then happens in the definition, which I think is it takes it to exactly where I want it to go. From these values flow principles of behaviour that enable academic communities to translate ideals into action. And I'll be sharing with you today my research over the last 10 years, particularly my most recent research through an Australian Learning and Teaching Council grant, which totally supports that definition using empirical data. So we start with the 5 fundamental values, and I'd like you to keep that in mind throughout the presentation. So, 10 years of research, 2 by 5, trying to fit the 5 in there. I started my work around the same time that everybody else seems to, apart from the ICAI. They were starting in the late 90s. But in terms of the work of our colleagues here in the UK, around 2002, people were very interested in it. And why is that? Well, I was working, my background is actually English literature and education, and I was working, as I know a couple of you are as well, teaching communication skills to international EAL, English as an Additional Language students, in a business faculty. So I've been, until recently, in a business faculty for 10 years. I'm not a business academic at all, so it's a strange place to be in. But I was teaching communication skills to international students, and I was flummoxed, overwhelmed, frustrated, angry by the huge volume of plagiarism in every assignment. And when we talk about assignments, we talk about authenticity of assessment, I would see amazing plagiarism even in an assignment, for example, where I asked students to write a short autobiography of their lives, to introduce themselves to me. I don't know how much more authentic you can have than that. I provided model answers, I put them on the web, and people used to copy from my life story. They said they couldn't say it any better, but it was my life. So it was very frustrating. I couldn't understand this. And I had this idea that it was only happening in my university, and I was very down on the University of South Australia. I was like, they're not dealing with plagiarism adequately. We've got problems with entry levels. I was very, very critical of the commercialisation of higher ed, and you never see it more up in your face than in a business school where, you know, people keep reminding you it's about bums on seats. You need bums on seats. We're keeping the rest of the university going. So so they say, I was critical, I was frustrated, I was angry, and I kept blaming people within my own university. I thought I was the only one who knew anything about this. So when I started doing my doctoral work, I was looking at internationalism in the internationalised university, very much a critique of the commercialisation of higher ed. And one small part of that project was looking at plagiarism and plagiarism policies around Australia. So I interviewed staff from 14 universities to find out their experience. Had they had the same thing happen to them? And these were staff from all sorts of different faculties right around Australia. Lo and behold, I was not alone. People were just as frustrated, they were just as angry, they were just as disappointed, they couldn't understand about the horrendous amount of plagiarism in all their courses. So what happened as a result of that research is I stopped being angry, because I started to realise there were people around like me who were trying to do good things, but it was a very complex problem. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. So that really started me on this journey of looking at academic integrity. And we, at that time, myself as well, we also were looking just at plagiarism. It was the big thing. And do you remember back in the day, 10 years ago, everything was about PPP, perplexities, plagiarism, perceptions, everything started with a P? I don't know what that was about. So I've had a changing research focus from starting there being angry about plagiarism by international students and angry at universities for not doing enough about it. That was around 2002 to 2004. I was also very interested in how to support international students avoid plagiarism and on that whole thing about the impact of commercialisation. It's not to say things have radically changed in that 10 years, but I have changed. I'm not so interested in being critical of those particular things. From 2005 to 2008, I became very interested in academics' self-plagiarism and other fraudulent publication practices. I can talk to you a little bit about that later. And I've presented various papers on that topic. And I was also interested in how to identify various forms of plagiarism using text matching software such as Turnitin, because that seemed like a very useful tool, and I thought Will explicated that very well earlier. It's a great tool, one of many, and in fact I think a paper I delivered here 4 years ago talked exactly about the role of academic judgment. From 2008 to 2009, I was looking at institutional responses to plagiarism and other breaches. And in particular, I was interested in academic integrity decision making. So my colleague Margaret Green and I interviewed academic integrity decision makers using the Oxford Brooks model, academic conduct officers, various different names around Australia as well, but people who are charged with the task of determining an outcome for a breach. So we interviewed those people and found out, if I had to put it in a nutshell, the biggest thing that we found out there was people were highly stressed by the position they were in, trying to work out a response, even with very good policy. It's a difficult job to be in. For the last 2 years, I've been working with a team of 9 people from 6 universities around Australia on an ALTC grant, Australian Learning and Teaching grant. We've had $180,000 for 2 years to look at this issue of aligning policy and practice in higher education and exploring various stakeholders' understandings of academic integrity. Much of today's presentation will be sharing those preliminary findings. We're still in that project. We finish it on the 30th of November. So we're right at the sticky end now, where we're trying to publish and create all sorts of resources. And I'm excited to say that just recently, just last week, it was announced I've just won another grant with a different team that I'll be working on for the next 12 months. We have $300,000 this time, thank you to the Office of Learning and Teaching, to extend and embed the lessons from the first project. So we're busy, and that's just our little side job. We actually have a regular job as well, the rest of us as well. So I've been involved in 5 big projects over that 10 years. The first one was our first conference in 2003 called Plagiarism and Other Perplexities. That was held at my university in South Australia, and you'll notice in your program that the 6th Asia Pacific Conference on Educational Integrity is being run in Sydney next year. You'll also notice that one of our little funny foibles in Australia is we refer to it as educational integrity. It's not that we don't use the word academic integrity, but we want to keep reminding people that it's not just about students. And very often when we use the word academic integrity, we keep thinking it's a student issue. When we preface the term with educational, we're saying it is a multi-stakeholder issue. It starts, I think you mentioned very well before, Craig, about teaching students right from the beginning. It starts in preschool. My 6-year-old granddaughter, she knows what cheating is. When I suggested we have Christmas a week early last year, she said, but that would be cheating. She understood that then. So it starts at the very beginning of schooling, and our research has actually shown that most students know, the vast majority of students have heard of academic integrity, understand what it is well before they come to university. That doesn't mean it's all solved and fixed. But we talk about educational integrity in our context simply because we want to make it clear that we're talking about multi-stakeholders and sectors. In 2003, I founded with my colleague Helen Marsden the Asia Pacific Forum on Educational Integrity, which is a conglomeration, actually it's an incorporated body now of universities around Australia. We model ourselves on the ICAI, but I don't think we're anywhere near where they are. But we're getting there. And then in 2005, with Helen Marsden again, I established the International Journal for Educational Integrity. We are running a special issue of that journal in December this year. We're very happy to accept submissions from the conference. So if you have a paper, whether it's refereed or not, please feel free to either go to the site, you can still Google, you'll find it, or send it to me. My email address is here. I'd be happy to send it out to review. We'd love to see your papers. So happy to accept papers. We just published volume 8, number 1 last week. So we've been going since 2005. I mentioned the 2010 ALTC project, and now our 2012 extending and embedding project. So 5 big projects that have been keeping us going for quite some time. So most of what I'm going to talk to you about really is this most recent project. It's the first time we had any real resources. Prior to winning the ALTC grant, we really were doing everything on the smell of an oily rag. We didn't have any grants, we had no money. People would say, by the way, when you send your papers to me for the journal, don't say, oh, let your editorial assistant fix that. That's me. So if you say, oh, can you format that for me? That'll be me. No. So, it's me and a group of other people who also have very little time for it. But to actually win the grant and for the Office for Learning and Teaching to say this is an important topic was a really big shift for us. It gave us time, it gave us workload to work on it. It also gave us a bit of kudos in our own universities where our own line managers were saying, hey, this is an interesting topic. Winning the new grant's even been a much bigger step too, so to win 2 grants back to back, suddenly the topic's right in front of people's faces. I'm still in a business faculty and all of a sudden my boss is saying, this is an interesting topic, tell me more. They like the money. But the money is a good thing because it does, I think, give you the time and the space you need to do the research. So our 5 milestones in the current project were to analyse Australian academic integrity policies at the public universities. We have 39 universities. So we analysed the publicly available policies online. We did a large student survey, which I'll talk to you about. We interviewed senior managers, pro-vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors, deans teaching and learning, and so on, heads of school. We conducted 28 focus groups with every type of student group you can imagine, plus staff, course coordinators, learning advisors, librarians, support staff, academic developers, and so on. And then our 5th milestone, of course, is where we're at right now, which is what does all this data mean and how do we use it to foster a culture of integrity? So some 5 key findings from our policy analysis. There are many more, and at the end of the presentation there is a link. And you can, if you just do a Google too, you'll find it. You can have a look at all of our papers we've been publishing as we go. But our 5 key findings in the policy analysis stage was that there's been a changing focus. Just as I have had a changing focus from being angry and thinking that they're bad students and plagiarism is a big problem, there's also been a changing focus in Australian policy. 51% of policies still had a focus on misconduct, but only 51. And our colleague of ours, Gabrielle Grigg, in 2008 did a similar policy analysis and she found it was more like 80%, even 4 years ago, that had that emphasis on misconduct. So it's shifting, only just over half still focus on misconduct, whereas 41% have really moved to integrity and education as the key focus. What was interesting to us is that 28% had a mixed focus. You're thinking, how can you have a mixed focus? Well, for example, the heading of the policy might have said, educative approaches to support student learning. And then the policy was actually all about, and if you breach the policy, you'll be sent to jail, you'll be hung out, to dry, we're going to excommunicate you from academic practice forever, we're going to ring your parents. Or conversely, the heading would be academic misconduct policy, but actually inside the policy was really beautifully enunciated educational practice. And I think that one of the reasons we have a bit of a mixed focus in a lot of policies now is that there has been a changing focus and people it's very hard to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you're using existing policy, you're trying to reshape it, and you end up with a bit of a mix. Sometimes you've just got to start from the beginning. We found that 10% of policies were concerned with risk management. We were pretty pleased about that because the cynics in us were thinking that a lot of universities care about their policies because they're worried about reputational risk, which is certainly the thing which has impressed upon me a lot in all the research I do. To get through ethics for anything is very, very difficult, and I have to keep reiterating over and over and over again. all data will be non-identifiable. No university will be identified. No one's going to know where this comes from. But it's a huge issue. So my feeling had been that many universities were very, very concerned about risk management, but in fact it was only about 10%. Students were still considered to be the ones primarily responsible for academic integrity, and the institution itself, as an organisation, was only mentioned in 39% of those policies. Most policies, 56%, lacked sufficient detail about breaches and outcomes. So it might say, we were talking before, Will said, it's hard, we don't know what plagiarism is. Well, lots of university policies don't know either. They don't tell the student, so it can't be surprising that the student breaches the policy, but there's not even enough detail about if you breach the policy, what will actually happen. And so that causes a lot of anxiety for students. I don't know what's going to happen. I've been called in for an investigation. I don't actually know what I've done, and I don't know what's going to happen now. 56% of the policies still lacked sufficient detail on those areas. And of interest to us is that the same number of policies had no mention of confidentiality. 56% didn't even mention confidentiality. Now, anyone in the room who's had to deal with breaches of academic integrity and going through an investigation knows how important confidentiality is. Staff are reluctant to initiate an investigation because they're concerned that it'll be on the student's record. They're concerned that another staff member will have access to that information. They're concerned that the student will somehow be victimised later because they've been found to have breached academic integrity. Without very clear guidelines about confidentiality, who's allowed to access the files and so on, those concerns are very valid. So that was interesting. They're the 5 key findings from our policy analysis. Having done the analysis, we then started to say, well, originally we thought, is it possible to come up with some sort of exemplary policy that we can share with the sector to explain, what you might need to do to create a good policy? It's actually very difficult. You can't create one policy and say, here it is, because of course every context is quite different. What we tried to identify from those 5 key findings were what we called 5 core elements of exemplary policy. Now, I didn't make the 5 up just for this conference. We really did identify 5 core elements. And we used this seal knot, it's Solomon's seal knot, which is like anyone who's a yachty or somebody who likes making knots here will know, it's a single strand of like rope, and it intertwines with each other. So it's one strand, not lots of separate strands. It all comes together. No element is privileged over another, so they're all mixed together. They're interconnected. When you pull the knot, it becomes very, very tight, very hard to undo. And we put the culture of integrity at the centre because we think without that overarching commitment, it doesn't matter how many elements you've got in your policy, it's not going to work. So just to give you a little bit of explication, and again, the full details are in our papers. So, and again, not in order of hierarchy, just happenstance. Access is all about whether that policy is easy to locate. Can you read it? Is it concise? Is it comprehensible? We found it actually, even though we were only looking at publicly available policies, it was actually very difficult often to find the policy. You'd find one and it would have a link to this one and this one and this one and this one, and those links were broken. So there were problems with links, there were problems with where it would go. We also found, and my colleague Margaret Green did a bit of an analysis for this for last year's conference, I think, about the readability of these policies. And she found that you need to have basically got a postgraduate degree before you can read most of these policies. But we're writing them for 18-year-olds who are just coming in. So is it comprehensible? Is it concise? Some policies, when you download them, are like that. Who has time, let alone interest, if you're a student? So that was the first part of the strand. Approach is the second one, and when we're talking about approach, we're talking about a statement of purpose with an educative focus up front and all through the policy, so none of this inconsistency. The third strand is responsibility, and when we talk about responsibility, we're talking about detailing responsibility for all stakeholders, students, administrators, senior staff, teaching staff, learning support, everyone in the academic community, not just students. The fourth strand is detail, and that's extensive but not excessive description. Remember before, 56% didn't actually give the correct detail, didn't give you adequate detail so you knew what a breach was, you don't know what collusion is, you don't know what plagiarism is, and then you don't know what the penalties are. You need adequate detail but not excessive, because again, you're going to end up with this great voluminous document. And the final strand, and the thing that really is integral to everything, is that adequate support mechanisms are in place. And I feel like I'm just repeating what Craig said earlier. But you need proactive and embedded systems to enable the implementation of the policy. Doesn't matter how great your policy is, if you don't actually have those systems in place, it also won't work out. So following our policy analysis, that took us about 6 months to do as a team, and you can imagine with 9 people, there was a lot of coding going on, a lot of discussion to work out those 5 core elements, which is why I have so much respect for the Fundamental Values Project now. I know what goes into that. We thought that we would get about 300 responses to our student survey, and all of us, with one exception, Sadia Mahmood, who's my research assistant, all of us are qualitative researchers. So we thought, yeah, 300, we can do that. We had 15,304 responses to our survey at 6 universities. We are still drowning in that data. Luckily, we have Sadia, who's a very good quantitative researcher, so she's been very, very helpful to us to analyse the data. It is the largest survey on academic integrity of its kind in Australia that we know of. There have been very large surveys done in the States and in various other locations, particularly by Don McCabe and his colleagues, but those surveys are quite different to what we wanted to do. We were not trying to get extra information about student cheating. We didn't want to know about the number, the frequency, the type, or the cause of breaches. We know that there are students out there who cheat, and the numbers vary from between 4 to 8% of students who cheat. We were not interested in that. We know that that happens. There's enough data to tell us that is the case. We didn't ask students to self-report their cheating behaviours. Again, we weren't interested in that. What we wanted to do was give students the opportunity to share their understandings of academic integrity and tell us how they want to be supported so that they don't accidentally breach academic integrity policy. So it was quite different in that way than the surveys that had done before. Now, I can only give you some highlights. I did have it down to 5, but there's not 5 now because I had to add a couple. But these are some of the big highlights from the survey. 64.5% of students said they'd heard of academic integrity and they thought they had a good idea of what it entails. So about 2/3 of our students felt pretty confident about that. 4.4% of the total number of students, which is a pretty small number, but double that for international EAL students, English as an additional language students, had never heard of the term, and they said they didn't know, they couldn't work it out what it meant. So 4.4 just said they had no clue, which was stunning to us given some other data we had which showed that most people had heard of it at school and so on. 64.7% said they knew whether their university had an integrity policy and they knew how to access it, so we've got about 2/3. Nearly 80% of the total students agreed that the policy was clearly communicated, but interestingly, when we probed further, that number went down to around 70% of postgraduate research students. We call them HDR students in Australia, higher degree by research students. So overall, about 80 said that the policy was clearly communicated, but only about 70% of our HDR students said that. And we want to explore why that's the case. I'll talk about that in a little minute. Here's an interesting thing. So if you have a look at that first number, we had about 2/3 of students saying they understood academic integrity. They could work it out what it means. So about 2/3 here. Now we go down to 94.2% of the total students, a little bit less for international, stated they felt confident they knew how to avoid a breach. That's a big jump. 2/3 know what it is, but nearly everybody says they're confident they can avoid a breach. So we're interested in that disjuncture as well. 92% of the total students, and interestingly, nearly 96% of our HDR students agreed that academic integrity is important beyond the university and their work and their personal lives. So the HDR students, the postgraduate research students, were the ones overwhelmingly say, we think it's very important, and yet we identified them as saying they didn't think the policy was clearly communicated to them adequately. So we think that that is a problematic group to address. So the 5 key findings, getting back to the 5, the majority reported a good understanding of integrity and AI policy, and they were satisfied with support and training. A disproportionate percentage felt confident about how to avoid a breach. I think that needs to be addressed. International students expressed a lower understanding of academic integrity and a lower confidence in how to avoid a breach. This is not surprising to anyone who's been working with international students, and as Craig mentioned before, there's a range of linguistic and cultural and educational background reasons why that might be the case. But it's a group of students we ignore to our peril. Postgraduate research students were the least satisfied with the information that they'd received, and there's that tiny group, the 4.4% of students, we're calling them educationally less prepared students who'd never heard of integrity. This is pretty important in the Australian context because we've had some changes recently where students can I don't know how to explain it simply. Let's say you normally need a 70. Let's call it a number, 70, to get into, say, a business program. Those numbers are lowering and lowering and lowering all the time. So we actually have many students coming in on 50. Now, they're the students that represent the 4.4%. Students who haven't been terribly engaged in the education process before, for whatever reason, are now coming in and not understanding some basic concepts. So they're the groups we've identified as being as requiring additional support. HDR students, higher degree by research students, international students, and those educationally less prepared students. As I mentioned, we also conducted interviews with senior managers, people at the very highest level. One of the things that at our last conference in Perth last year, Mark Israel, one of our keynotes said, and I'm interested because Craig was talking about the importance of people from the very top being involved in this process, and I would say from the very bottom, and then everyone in between. But what Mark Israel said at our last conference was, I love this conference, it's great, it's so inviting, but where are all the senior managers? Where are the vice chancellors? Where are the pro-vice chancellors? Where are the deputy deans and the directors of teaching and learning? Where are they? It seems like everyone on the ground here is so engaged and they're wanting to talk about how to improve practice right on the ground, but where are those senior managers? So we went and interviewed them to find out what they thought. And today I don't have time to report on all of those 30 interviews. Again, voluminous data still being analysed, but I will share with you some preliminary analysis from the first question we asked them. We just asked them that simple question, can you share with us your understanding of academic integrity? And many respondents were reluctant to focus on the positives. Invariably, people would talk about plagiarism and student misconduct. And we kept having to say, no, that's the opposite of integrity. That's not academic integrity. You're talking about breaches of integrity. Can you talk to us about what integrity entails? And here's a little quote from one manager. They said, the only time anyone's ever really thinking about notions of academic integrity is when they're reducing it simply to academic misconduct and pinging someone for plagiarism, which is so true. We don't talk about it otherwise. It's only when there's misconduct, and that is the first thing that comes to many people's minds. So what we did find, though, I did an analysis of those responses to those questions. So out of 279 references in vivo, and I found that, in fact, this is how people responded. We had 20 themes, actually, which I've collapsed down to 5. Again, not for the conference, it just happened that way, which is why I ended up talking about the big 5 of academic integrity. When people were talking about integrity, they talked about what they do in their community. They talked about acknowledgement practices, they talked about scholarship. People talked about what academic freedom is in terms of being able to write and research according to their interest. They talked about the things they do every day as a teacher, as an academic, as a researcher. And you can see here. So this large group here, 36% of the references were coded under academic practices. The second largest category was values. Here. And people certainly mentioned the 5 fundamental values from the ICAI, but they also mentioned other values that were, I guess, were maybe more Australian context driven. They talked about equity, they talked about authenticity as well, and we coded those under values as well. And the third category was complexity, where people talked about it being a multifaceted issue, multi-stakeholder. If they talked about it being for students and staff and administrators and so on, we coded it there. And you can see here, just this little group, even though we had this sense that people kept talking about academic integrity in a negative way, only 13% of our responses were coded according to misconduct. And then the final little area, this one here, quality assurance actually only accounted for 8% of those responses. So people were talking about the reputation of the university. And remember, that matches our policy analysis. Our policy analysis showed that 10% of the policies were related to reputation and so on, reputation risk. So quality assurance was about the same, 8%. So what I think we can say, this is not a definition of academic integrity, and it's very preliminary, but what we can say from those responses from our interviewees, that there are 5 foundation concepts. Academic integrity is grounded in action. It's what we do. It's underpinned by values, which makes the Fundamental Values Project so very important to all of us. I do urge you all to go to the ICAI and have a look at the project. I read it again last night. It's so beautifully articulated. It's multifaceted and applicable to multiple stakeholders. It is understood in terms of what it's not, that is misconduct. And at first, when we were doing this analysis, we were like, well, that doesn't actually fit with the concept. We've got to put that over there in some other space. But the fact is, all of us do it. Every time we talk about integrity, we immediately go to talking about what it's not. Now, maybe that's reasonable. It's like when you're trying to explain to somebody, what is honesty? You often have to explain, well, honesty is when you tell the truth. What's telling the truth? When you don't lie. So maybe that's not unreasonable, and that's certainly how people understand integrity, by what it's not, but only 13% of the time. And it is important, it really is important, as a means of assuring the quality and credibility of the educational process. So I thought I'd share with you just a couple of brief excerpts from the interview data. This is from a senior academic at University A, beautifully non-identifiable, and I've colour-coded it to match that little pie chart. So this person said, I guess when we talk about academic integrity, we usually take the student's perspective, and it's primarily associated with students not plagiarising work, either intentionally or unintentionally. And it's also, I think, there's a broader thing in there about general ethical behaviour in terms of approaches to study and assessment and interaction with others. And I think there's also a responsibility on the part of academics to be role models and embed principles of academic integrity into our work. All the things that Craig was talking about before. And you can see, though, they start by talking about what it's not. But this a little bit longer excerpt, I think, is a lovely positive focus. When we first started the project, we were thinking we might be able to come up with a new definition of academic integrity, something that we could share across the sector in Australia. I'm not sure if that's possible or even appropriate at this point, but it is worth exploring when you can articulate it this way, according to the positives. So academic integrity encompasses a number of values and ideals that should be upheld in an academic institution. Within the academy, there's a fundamental obligation to exercise integrity, which includes honesty, trustworthiness, and respect. Within an academic structure, those values must be evident in the research as well as the teaching and learning activities of the institution. Academic integrity involves ensuring that in research and in teaching and learning, both staff and students act in an honest way, that they're open and accountable for their actions, and that they exhibit fairness and transparency when they're dealing with people or with research. I actually really love that. Not just in terms of your research, not just with your textual work, but your dealings with people as well. Furthermore, it's important that staff members at all levels be role models and demonstrate integrity as an example to students who'll progress through the education system and then transition into professional life. I love that too, because it's talking about this is relevant to you for the rest of your life. And we found that such a large proportion of students agreed with that. Academic integrity impacts on students and staff in these core activities and is fundamental to the reputation and standing of an organisation and its members. Beautiful. Covers it so well. So for us so far, I think that's the best excerpt that I've had from the interview data. Still very much in a preliminary analysis. Still working on it. So the 5 deliverables from the current project. We've looked at exemplary elements of academic integrity policy. By the end of the project, 30th of November, we'll actually have got a little bit plagiarising from the HEA. No, not plagiarising, just standing on the shoulders of giants. The HEA has actually been really instrumental to our work. When we did our analysis of policy, we went back to PolicyWorks and to the support for academic integrity document as well, and we juxtaposed what we did against what the HEA had done. And it's been a fantastic anchor to our work. But what we've tried to do, just as the HEA has done, by drawing out examples of good policy, we've done the same in the Australian context. It's been tricky to do that though, because as soon as you show one element which is good, then other people will say, well, what about our policy? So that document will be available to anyone, it's all freely available, but to people in the higher education sector in Australia to look at their own policy and look at exemplary elements. We've developed a whole range of academic integrity breach case studies for use in staff development and as teaching and learning resources. So you can look at a little scenario. It's got some accompanying resources with it and some questions for discussion. They're usually, and a PowerPoint that goes with them. Again, that will all be freely available. Feel free to go to the site and have a look. We're also developing some online teaching and learning activities. We don't have enough money to make everything fantastic and shiny, but what we are going to do, we've got a bunch of PDF documents that are handy to use in the classroom, and we're going to make one of those into multiple different ways of presenting it, including an online format. Just one to give people ideas. We've got a whole bunch of good practice recommendations, including links to the best sites we think that are around the world. And here's the final one. We thought we were going to come up with a shared definition of academic integrity. Not sure if we can or will or should. What we can say is what our respondents have said in terms of their understandings of integrity. And we'll keep analysing that for the next few months. So I've been talking about the big five of academic integrity. I talked about values, understandings, and elements of policy, and how do they all fit together. Here's my iceberg. Apologies to Freud. You can see here that we have this whole great big section under the ocean of values. Now, of course, we love the five fundamental values, and there's a whole bunch of other values we might also talk about. The difficulty, however, with values is these take time to grow, to shape, to develop. This is not something we can go into a university and suddenly say, these are the values we think you should exhibit. What we can do is recognise that they are under the surface and they're hard to get at. We can try to get at people's understandings here, this pre-conscious stuff right beneath the surface. Often when we did our interviews, people were like, I've never actually tried to articulate it before, so that was challenging. So those things were just beneath the surface. But what we have been able to do, because these things are very transparent, they're sitting above the surface, is look at policy. We've looked at policy, it's all accessible, it's all available publicly on the websites and so on. So policy is somewhere where we really can make an impact, I think. Not to say we can't make an impact on these other areas. And of course, the whole iceberg idea is that these things are so huge and underpinning everything else. But we can look at policy, and then the thing, of course, we want to do, our dream, is to impact on policy implementation, what actually happens in practice. So that takes me to the what next. That's our next project, where we're going to be extending and embedding exemplary academic integrity policy in the sector. As I mentioned, we only have 12 months though, so the ALTC project finishes on the 30th of November. I begin the next one on the 1st of December and have exactly 12 months to deliver. So we have to have a very tight project and think, what have we learned in the first project and how can we extend those lessons and share them further? We want to extend and embed those 5 core elements across the sector. We want to develop resources that are accessible to both public and private higher education providers. Many of you may not know that the system in Australia is changing quite substantially. So we had 39 public universities, we've got hundreds of private providers. They are now all coming under the same legislation, so our private providers, usually pathway colleges, will have the same requirements in terms of academic integrity as the other public universities. And so the new project has a private provider as part of the team to try to embed those good practice elements there as well. We want to develop more support systems for international English as an additional language students. We know they need help. We know it continues to be an area that needs more support. We want to really identify and develop support systems for those educationally less prepared students, those 4.4% of students, double of which were the international students. And we want to extend our lessons about policy and support to higher education by degree students as well, the postgraduate research students. Those 3 core groups of students, we want to extend our lessons to those. How are we going to do it? Well, we've got a really, really focused research team. It's small. It's got both public and private providers in the team. We have a reference group. Now, here's the thing that's quite different. Our reference group is comprised of the most senior people from the 5 universities we identified as having exemplary policy. We can't make that publicly available just yet, but those deputy vice-chancellors, deans teaching and learning, are going from the 5 top universities, the ones with the best policies, are all going to be meeting with us, along with Erica Morris from HEA Academy. Are you here, Erica? Yay, hi! I've been looking for you. Erica's going to be coming out and giving us her fantastic pearls of wisdom, sharing what you've learned from the HEA. We've also got Tricia Bertram-Glant coming from North America. And we have Helen Marsden, who you may recall started the journal with me and was instrumental in the first conference. She's now working in the area of higher education, high degree by research education. So we have a really focused reference group with people from the top coming, and the idea is they will come to 2 days to Adelaide. We know their policies are good, but we want to hear from them. What do you actually do in practice at your institution? And we do a bit of action research, get some data from that 2-day roundtable, and then extend it back out into the sector. We're going to have a national speaking tour. Must talk to you about that, Erica. She's like, what? We'll be developing and trialling those resources and, of course, making really tangible, concrete resources available to all stakeholders, including everyone in this room. They will be freely available. So, the big 5 of academic integrity. We started by saying that academic integrity is a commitment, even in the face of adversity, to 5 fundamental values: honesty, trust, fairness, respect, and responsibility. We said that understandings of integrity are based on 5 foundation concepts: academic practices, values, complexity, misconduct, and quality assurance. And we said that exemplary academic integrity policy is comprised of 5 core elements relating to the connected strand of access, approach, responsibility, detail, and support. I would say that both aspirations, for example, towards values, often we have aspirations, we want students to be honest, we want ourselves to be honest and trustworthy and so on. I would say that both aspirations and evidence-based practices are critical to developing cultures of integrity. It's been an exciting part of the work I do to really develop empirically based ideas about how to proceed. Implementing exemplary policy requires sustained commitment from all stakeholders, and we keep hearing that again and again. And what we do know is that higher education is a dynamic environment. It changes from day to day, it seems, year to year. Processes, policies are continually in flux. And so our approaches need to also be responsive and adaptable to change. We're not suggesting that anything we're doing in our current research is a one size fits all. What we're trying to say is here's some ideas, adapt them, use them, change them, but get the dialogue started. If you'd like to find out more about any of the projects I've been talking about today, they're all freely available at this site. I encourage you to look at the Fundamental Values site, and you can also access all of my publications on my website. Thanks so much. It's been fun. I've really enjoyed sharing my findings and my research with you, and I look forward to lots of conversations over the next 2 days.